In the deep twilight of late autumn 1983, the streets of London were bustling as usual. Yet in the windows of the Soviet embassy, the lights remained on until dawn. A young foreign intelligence officer, pressed to the eyepiece of a powerful pair of binoculars, spent hours observing not the movements of diplomats or military equipment, but the windows of the British Ministry of Defense and the offices of large banks. His task was not the theft of secret codes, but something far stranger and more frightening. He was to count how many windows in government buildings remained lit after 9 p.m., how often couriers delivered food to the offices of high-ranking officials, and whether the work schedule of civilian administrations had changed. This man was but a tiny cog in a grand and secret machine codenamed Rocket Nuclear Attack, or RYAN for short. In those days, the top leadership in Moscow was in a state of profound alarm, bordering on obsession. They were absolutely convinced that the United States of America and its NATO allies were on the verge of delivering a devastating first strike that would once and for all wipe their country off the political map of the world. The history of this operation is not just a chronicle of espionage, it is a captivating and terrifying exploration of how the human mind, gripped by distrust and fear, begins to see signs of an impending doomsday in the most mundane details of urban life. To understand why the world's largest intelligence service suddenly switched to counting cars in hospital parking lots, one must go back to the early 1980s. The decade of détente, when the two superpowers tried to negotiate arms reductions, had definitively passed. It was replaced by an era of unprecedented tension. In the United States, a leader came to power who made no secret of his extremely harsh attitude towards the Eastern Bloc, openly calling it an evil empire. At the same time in Moscow, the reins of power passed into the hands of Yuri Andropov, a man who had headed the Committee for State Security for decades. Andropov was a brilliant analyst, but his professional deformation led him to see hidden motives and insidious plans behind any action of an opponent. He believed that the West was no longer interested in parity and was preparing a scenario for a sudden disarming strike. The logic was simple and ruthless. If the enemy decided to start a total confrontation, they would not do so demonstratively. They would prepare under the guise of everyday life, using ordinary military exercises as a screen for the deployment of real forces. It was this concept that formed the basis of Operation RYAN, which became the largest and most complex intelligence program in human history, aiming to detect the moment when the world would pass the point of no return. The main external conflict of this era unfolded on the battlefields of strategic planning and technological race. In the early 1980s, the security situation sharply deteriorated due to the emergence of new types of weapons. The United States began deploying intermediate-range ballistic missiles called Pershing II in Western Europe. These systems possessed phenomenal accuracy and, most terrifyingly for Moscow, an extremely short flight time. From the territory of the Federal Republic of Germany, such a missile could reach the central command posts of the Soviet leadership in just 6 or 8 minutes. This practically deprived the attacked side of the ability to launch a retaliatory strike. In the eyes of Soviet generals and politicians, this looked like preparation for a decapitating maneuver. In parallel, Washington announced the launch of the Strategic Defense Initiative program, which the press immediately dubbed Star Wars. The idea of creating an anti-missile shield in space seemed fantastic at the time, but in Moscow, it was perceived as a direct threat. If one side obtains absolute protection, its hands are untied for attack without fear of retribution. This disrupted the decades-long balance of mutually assured destruction, which, paradoxically, was the sole guarantor of peace on the planet. In response to these challenges, the Committee for State Security developed an intricate system of indicators designed to signal the commencement of preparations for an attack. More than 40,000 signs were identified in total, which residencies worldwide were obliged to monitor around the clock. The list of these signs was striking in its diversity and attention to detail. Operatives were instructed to track the availability of free beds in major civilian hospitals. If authorities began mass discharges of patients, this could signify the preparation of beds for future casualties. Special attention was paid to blood banks and medical supplies. Intelligence officers recorded changes in the operating hours of ministries, movements of mid-level officials, and even the quantity of pizza ordered at the Pentagon offices at night. Logic suggested that before the start of a large-scale conflict, the bureaucratic apparatus would begin to operate under increased load, meaning people would stay at their workplaces late and more often use food delivery services. Even the behavior of taxi drivers and the frequency of scheduled bus movements near military installations became subjects of meticulous analysis. However, beneath this facade of objective data lay a profound internal conflict that tore at the minds of the decision-makers. Yuri Andropov, already seriously ill and spending much time in hospital wards, remained a prisoner of his intelligence past. His fear of a sudden strike was transmitted down the chain, transforming into a rigid demand for subordinates to find confirmation of impending aggression. Staff of residencies in Washington, London, Paris, and Bonn found themselves in an extremely difficult position. Those who tried to report that the situation remained calm and that no real signs of war preparations were observed risked being accused of losing vigilance, or, even worse, of professional incompetence. The system was tuned to search for alarming signals, and it began to generate them, even if they were products of imagination or misinterpretation. Young officers, seeking to distinguish themselves or simply to protect themselves from the wrath of their superiors, began to attach sacred meaning to any random coincidences. If on a Saturday night there were 5 more cars than usual in the parking lot of a British government building, it was immediately recorded in the report as a sign of heightened readiness. A vicious circle effect emerged. Intelligence reported increased tension. The leadership reacted by raising the combat readiness of its forces, which, in turn, was noticed by Western services and provoked their reciprocal reaction. The world was turning into a room of mirrors, where every gesture was reflected and distorted, giving rise to new fears. The ideological confrontation of that era extended far beyond the struggle between two economic systems. It was a clash of fundamental beliefs about the nature of humanity and statehood. In the West, there was a belief in the power of open institutions, and it was thought that their resolve and technological superiority would force the opponent to make concessions. In Moscow, however, the dominant idea was that the capitalist world, in its quest for dominance, was prepared to go to extreme lengths if it sensed weakness in its adversary. The paradox was that both sides sought security, but the methods they chose made the world increasingly dangerous. The philosophy of deterrence, based on fear, led to both superpowers becoming hostages to their technical systems. Decisions on which the lives of billions depended had to be made within minutes, based on data transmitted by computers and intelligence reports. The human factor became both the weakest and simultaneously the most crucial link in this chain. Trust was completely destroyed, and in its place grew a gigantic superstructure of suspicion, where even sincere peace initiatives were perceived as attempts at disinformation and lulling vigilance before a decisive strike. The situation reached its climax in November 1983, when large-scale NATO exercises called Able Archer 83 began. Unlike previous maneuvers, these exercises included practicing procedures for preparing to use nuclear weapons, including testing communication systems and transmitting authorization codes. To Soviet intelligence, this looked like a perfect cover for a real attack. An atmosphere bordering on panic reigned at the KGB headquarters in Yasenevo and on Lubyanka. The signs collected as part of Operation Ryan began to flash bright red. The movement of staff groups to underground bunkers, changes in radio communication frequencies, and the transition of troops in Europe to higher levels of readiness were noted. At one point, the Soviet leadership seriously considered the possibility of a preemptive strike to avoid being caught off guard. Atomic submarines went to sea, and long-range aviation was brought to maximum combat readiness. The world was just one wrong decision, one pressed button away from a global catastrophe, which most ordinary citizens were not even aware of, continuing their daily routines. A transformation in perception only occurred when information about the depth of Soviet paranoia began to leak to the West. Oleg Gordievsky, a high-ranking KGB officer who had been secretly cooperating with British intelligence for a long time, played a huge role in this. It was he who provided Western leaders with reports on how seriously Moscow perceived the Able Archer 83 exercises. When the President of the United States and his entourage reviewed this data, they were truly shocked. They realized that their attempts to demonstrate strength and resolve were interpreted not as an element of deterrence, but as a direct and immediate threat to the opponent's existence. It turned out that the leaders in the Kremlin were not just playing political games. They were genuinely frightened. This revelation fundamentally changed Washington's approach to dealing with Moscow. It became clear that further escalation of fear could lead to an accidental conflict in which there would be no winners. This moment became a turning point, after which a slow and difficult path began towards restoring communication channels and finding ways for real disarmament. The culmination of this invisible confrontation arrived when the exercises concluded without a single shot fired, and the world, holding its breath, realized it had walked along the very edge of an abyss. This was a time when the technological perfection of annihilation systems clashed with primeval human fear. In Moscow, it was realized that Operation Ryan, intended to provide answers, in reality only multiplied questions and intensified anxiety. Analysis of the accumulated data showed that many of the 40,000 indicators were useless or misleading. The fact that there were many empty beds in hospitals could have been a consequence of a seasonal decrease in illness, rather than preparation for receiving casualties. Lit windows in ministries could indicate a mundane preparation for the annual financial report, not war planning. The entire colossal mass of information proved useless without an understanding of the other side's psychology and intentions. This was a moment of truth for intelligence communities. Gathering facts without understanding the context leads to catastrophic errors. The tension began to subside, and both sides realized the necessity of creating more transparent mechanisms for interaction, to exclude the possibility of a fatal error due to misinterpretation of a neighbor's actions. The resonance of those years' events is felt even today, reminding us how easily complex systems can spiral out of control under the pressure of mutual distrust. The lesson of Operation Ryan is that informational superiority is not only about having a vast amount of data, but also the ability to analyze it correctly, filtering out noise and false signals. In the era of modern technologies, when the speed of information transfer has increased thousands of times, and artificial intelligence algorithms can make decisions faster than humans, the risk of accidental conflict due to misinterpretation of data remains relevant. The paranoia of the 80s showed that secrecy and lack of dialogue turn every trifle into a cause for suspicion. Today's world, filled with hybrid threats and information wars, largely resembles that atmosphere, where every step is perceived through the prism of possible provocation. Studying the history of this secret project helps to understand that true security is built not on the height of walls and the number of missiles, but on the ability of sides to hear each other and not allow fear to replace reality. Concluding this immersion into one of the Cold War's darkest pages, we inevitably return to the image of that very scout at the embassy window. Today, different people might be sitting in those same buildings, looking at the same streets and the same windows, but the world around them has changed beyond recognition. We tend to believe that modern defense and diplomatic systems make us more secure, but the history of Operation Ryan teaches us humility. It reminds us that even the most powerful empires can become hostages to their own fears and misinterpreted signs. The fact that humanity managed to avoid a definitive end in 1983 is more a result of fortunate coincidence and the courage of individuals than the reliability of security systems. We must remember these lit windows of the night city not as a target for intelligence, but as a symbol of a fragile peace that requires constant care, openness, and a rejection of the destructive logic of mutual annihilation. After all, ultimately, behind each of these windows live ordinary people whose fates should not depend on how many portions of food were ordered to ministerial offices or how long a lamp burned in a high-ranking official's office. The process of accumulating alarming signals in those years was escalating, affecting even the most unexpected spheres of life. Intelligence officers were tasked with monitoring the antique and art markets. It was believed that before the outbreak of war, wealthy people would begin to massively sell off their collections to convert them into more mobile assets or gold. Even the prices of meat and long-term storage products in supermarkets were analyzed. Any price fluctuation was considered a sign that the state was beginning a covert procurement of food to create strategic reserves. This was a time when information became both a weapon and a curse. Huge volumes of data flowing into Moscow from hundreds of residencies required processing, which even the most powerful computing machines of the time could barely handle. In this informational chaos, truly important messages were lost, giving way to those that better fit into a pre-established worldview. A special place in this story is occupied by the psychological state of Yuri Andropov, a man who possessed colossal power. In the last months of his life, he was physically isolated due to severe kidney disease. His connection to the world was carried out through folders of reports brought to him by assistants. In conditions of isolation, his suspicion only intensified. He believed that the West saw his weakness and the weakness of the Soviet leadership as a whole and could take advantage of this moment to strike. For him, Operation Ryan was not just an intelligence task, but a way to maintain control over a reality that was slipping away from him. This personal drama of the ruler was superimposed on the global drama of confrontation, creating an explosive mixture in which the leader's personal fears turned into state policy, determining the fate of millions of people. On the other side of the ocean, President Ronald Reagan, despite his tough rhetoric, was also undergoing a complex internal transformation. His conviction that the Soviet bloc should be dealt with from a position of strength began to clash with the realization that this strength could be perceived as a call for a suicidal attack. In his memoirs, he later wrote that he was genuinely surprised by how much Soviet leaders feared an American attack. He considered the United States a peace-loving nation and could not imagine that anyone could seriously suspect them of intending to start a nuclear war. This misunderstanding of each other's fundamental fears was perhaps the greatest danger of that era. Different cultures, different historical experiences, and different value systems led to the sides speaking different languages, even using the same terms. The philosophical conflict of Operation Ryan also lay in the question of the limits of knowing the enemy's intentions. Is it possible, from indirect signs, from the movement of transport or the operating mode of cafeterias, to understand what is going on in the mind of another state's leader? Soviet intelligence believed it was possible, creating a gigantic mathematical model of war. But life turned out to be more complex than any models. People's actions often do not obey strict logic or pre-written scenarios. Chance, error, personal sympathy or antipathy can play no less a role in history than the movement of tank divisions. The realization of this fact became a bitter lesson for many strategists who were accustomed to seeing the world only as a chessboard where pieces move according to iron rules. When we analyze the consequences of this operation, it becomes clear that it not only brought the world to the brink of catastrophe, but also laid the foundation for subsequent warming of relations. The paradox is that it was precisely the extreme degree of fright that forced the parties to seek paths to reconciliation. After the crisis of 1983, the intensity of dialogue between Moscow and Washington began to grow. New emergency communication lines were established, procedures for notifying about military exercises were improved, and serious negotiations on the elimination of entire classes of missiles began. The fear of an accidental war proved stronger than ideological differences. This was a triumph of common sense over paranoia, although the path to this triumph lay through a zone of mortal danger. In the contemporary context, the experience of Operation Ryan forces us to look anew at the problem of transparency. In a world where information spreads instantly, and deep fakes and disinformation can distort any reality, trust becomes the most valuable and rare resource. We see how today, states are once again beginning to monitor each other's indirect signs of activity, using satellite intelligence and big data analysis. However, technical means alone do not guarantee security. If behind them lies a mind set on conflict and suspicion, any satellite image can be interpreted as preparation for aggression. The lesson of history is that we need to invest more, not in surveillance systems, but in understanding systems. In the finale of this story, we once again find ourselves in those anxious days of November 1983. We see how communication officers clutch envelopes with codes in their hands, how strategic bomber pilots sit in cockpits awaiting orders, and how peaceful residents of London, Washington, and Moscow sleep, unaware that their lives hang by a thread. This moment of maximum tension serves as an eternal reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and ashes. The story of Operation Ryan is not only a tale of spies and missiles, it is a tale of human responsibility, about how, at the most critical moment, it is precisely man, his ability to doubt, and his desire to live, who becomes the last barrier on the path to the abyss. And when we look at the lights of night cities today, we should value them not as indicators of activity, but as the light of life itself, which continues despite all predictions and fears of the past. The world we know today largely owes its existence to those who, in those critical moments, managed to keep a cool head. This is a story about how important it is not to let your fears dictate the terms of reality. Operation Ryan remained in the archives as a monument to an era of great mistrust, but its echo continues to resound, warning us against repeating old mistakes at a new technological level. We must remember that behind every number in an intelligence report, behind every item on a list of indicators, there are living people. And as long as we are able to see in an opponent not only a threat, but also a fellow human being, burdened by their fears and hopes, we still have a chance for a peaceful future. The tragedy that did not happen became the most important lesson of the 20th century, a lesson that we have no right to forget in the 21st century. Every time political rhetoric becomes too sharp and military exercises start to resemble actual force deployments, it's worth remembering those lit windows in London in '83. That invisible front, where not bullets but meanings were fought, showed that the most terrible war is one that begins in people's minds long before the first volley. Overcoming this internal conflict, abandoning the logic of Ryan in favor of the logic of cooperation, is the only way to avoid the moment when indicators of catastrophe preparation become reality. Let this story serve as a reminder that the light in the windows of government buildings should signify diligent work for peace, not frantic planning for the end of history. And in this cyclical return to the beginning, to that very moment of observation, we find hope that reason will always be one step ahead of madness. Decades later, many documents from that period were declassified, allowing historians to reconstruct the picture of events with frightening accuracy. We learned the names of those who doubted and those who insisted on the harshest measures. These dry lines of reports today read like a thriller script, where all of humanity was at stake. But behind all these facts and dates shines one simple truth. Peace is not a natural state, but the result of daily efforts to restrain one's own demons. Operation Ryan showed us a mirror reflecting our deepest fears. And now, our task is not to let this reflection gain flesh and blood again in our present and future. Concluding this narrative, we understand that history does not end. It merely changes its scenery. The questions raised during Operation Ryan remain relevant. How to distinguish a real threat from an imagined one, how to maintain trust in an atmosphere of hostility, and how not to fall victim to one's own information system. We continue to seek answers to these questions today, relying on the experience of those who stood on the brink in 1983 and found the strength to step back. This legacy is our main capital in preserving peace on a planet that remains our only and common home in boundless space. Thus, the story of the project to find signs of a missile nuclear attack transforms from a technical report into a philosophical parable about humanity learning to live in the shadow of its own power. This is a narrative about the importance of maintaining humanity in a world where everything is measured by numbers and algorithms. And as long as we remember these lessons, as long as we are able to analyze our past without anger and bias, we have the opportunity to write new chapters of our shared history, in which there will be no place for operations like Ryan, but only for creation and mutual respect. Let the shadows of the past be for us not a source of fear, but a guide helping to avoid dangerous traps on the path to a safer and more just world order. The events of those years clearly demonstrated that even the most perfect intelligence can be powerless if it does not take into account the psychological context. The vast array of data collected during Operation Ryan ultimately turned out to be noise that almost drowned out the voice of reason. This is an important lesson for modern information society. An abundance of information does not mean understanding the truth. On the contrary, an excess of data often serves only to confirm existing prejudices. True wisdom lies in the ability to see living intentions behind facts, and the ability to distinguish random coincidences from natural processes. Ultimately, Operation Ryan became a symbol of an entire era, when the world lived in a state of constant expectation of catastrophe. But it was precisely this expectation that made humanity realize its vulnerability and the value of every moment of peaceful life. Today, looking back, we can gratefully remember those who did not succumb to panic and were able to stop in time. Their unseen feat remains in the shadow of great historical events, but it is thanks to it that today we have the opportunity to discuss the past, plan the future, and simply enjoy the quiet of the evening streets, where the light in the windows means the warmth of home and not preparation for the last battle in the history of mankind.